Brienne awoke to the cold sunlight seeping through the narrow window slit, her breath blooming in the dim air. She lay in the large bed once reserved for the Lady of Winterfell, covers bunched at her waist, shoulders bare to the chill of the room. Over the past weeks, though the fire roared in the hearth each night, the cold never entirely left her bones. The North had its grip on every stone and every soul, and she supposed it always would. She did not mind it. Rather, she felt the bite of the cold with a certain satisfaction, a reminder that she had survived and overcome far worse storms. She ran a hand over the woolen blanket, feeling the coarse fibers against her calloused palm. Her scarred fingers, with their thickened knuckles, seemed out of place on top of such fine weaving, yet she had grown more accustomed to these luxuries than she thought possible. Even now, a part of her felt she should slip out of this chamber and return to the modest quarters reserved for a knight in service, no matter what her new station required. Old habits, old oaths, they clung to her. But times had changed. When the Raven arrived from King's Landing confirming the North's acceptance of the arrangement, Brienne as Lady of Winterfell, she found herself gripped by both awe and trepidation. The letter had come with wax seals and a careful script that recognized her authority in the name of peace and alliance. But words on a parchment were one thing. Winning the hearts and trust of the Northern Lords was another matter entirely. Many looked to her with suspicion, confusion, or outright resentment. Yet Sansa Stark, the rightful Lady of Winterfell before Brienne, had insisted upon it. Sansa had entrusted her home to the woman she believed was the most honorable, the most loyal. Sansa had greater designs now. A new path forging alliances in the south, a hush of new politics that might strengthen the North in a more subtle way. So she had passed the keep into Brienne's care. It was no easy thing to hand over one's ancestral seat, but Sansa had done it with her usual calm conviction, and with an embrace that told Brienne that this duty, though heavy, was not only a necessity but also something Sansa believed Brienne capable of. Brienne rose from the bed, reaching for the rough-spun shift she'd draped over the armchair the night before. As she slipped it on, she found herself gazing into the mirror, a polished steel plate hinged upon dark wood. Her reflection stared back, tall and broad, with hair the color of dirty straw, and a sternness around her eyes that had grown sharper over the years. Only a faint dusting of freckles across her cheeks betrayed any youth or softness. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the hush of Winterfell enclose her. She had known nights in tents pitched on muddy battlefields, nights spent on a bedroll under the open sky, nights in drafty inns or on hard floors near a stable for want of coin. For so many years, she had not dared imagine a place of her own. Even Tarth, her homeland, had never felt so fully welcoming. She had been an oddity to her father's court, a daughter too tall and too skilled with a sword for their comfort. But here, in these Northlands, she at least felt respected, if still regarded with wary eyes. She had earned her place by sword and vow. Her steps took her to the hearth. She coaxed the embers to life, adding a small log. The orange glow fed on the dry wood, snapping as it rose. The warmth fanned across her hands. She breathed in, gathering herself for the day ahead. When she exited her chamber, the corridor stretched long and dusky, cold stone walls lit by a few torches that had not yet been replaced. Dawn had only just begun its gentle creep across the castle, stirring servants and guards to their duties. Brienne's boots echoed softly. Her height often forced her to hunch slightly beneath Winterfell's doorframes, but in the corridor, she could stand tall. As she passed by a window overlooking the courtyard, she paused. She saw the yard spanned with fresh fallen snow, crisp and white in the early light, with a few footprints beginning to track from the stables to the kitchens. A pair of stable boys pulled a reluctant mule along the path, and the clink of metal told her men-at-arms were already practicing on the western side. The hush was companionable, as if the castle still dozed. She reflected that once she might have joined those men in the yard first thing in the morning, limbering her arms, practicing her sword thrusts, testing her footwork. She would have been in a simple surcoat, not in fine clothes. She would have nodded at them with the courtesy of a guard or a sworn sword. Now, she bore a heavier burden. She had to bear the courtesy and scrutiny of a lady. Brienne turned from the window and continued down the steps, passing the great hall. The corridor opened into a smaller chamber that had become her solar, Sansa's old domain. Shallow but broad windows along one wall let in the pale light, illuminating a table strewn with parchments, map scrolls, and the remains of last night's supper. A wooden chair with carved wolves on the armrests stood behind the table. She had sat there many evenings, trying to will her mind to the complexities of grain stores, supply lines, tax tallies, all the mundane details of governance. She had once told Sansa, "I am no lady, my lady." Sansa had only smiled. "You have it in you," she'd replied. "You've always had it in you." The smell of ink and parchment lingered, mingling with the faint aroma of cooled bread and roasted onions. Maester Wallace, newly assigned to Winterfell after the last maester had retired south, was bent over a scroll, scribbling notes in that neat, practiced hand. He was short and wiry, with a fringe of gray hair at his temples. He glanced up when he heard her footsteps. "Good morrow, my lady," he said, with a polite bow of his head. She was still growing used to that address. In the first weeks, he had hesitated, uncertain whether to call her Sir or my lady. She had told him she accepted either, but for official business, he was to use the title the realm recognized. "If you're in need of sustenance, the kitchens have fresh bread." "Thank you, Maester," she said, stepping closer to the table, eyes scanning the papers. Some of the script indicated reports from last hearth, from Carhold. Others were trade notes. It felt strange to see her name, Brienne of House Tarth, listed beside official business in the north. "Did we receive any word this morning?" He set aside his quill. "Only a dispatch from White Harbor. Lord Manderley extends his greetings and confirms he will attend the winter feast next moon's turn. He writes that the roads should be stable enough for his retinue. He also inquires if the rumors are true that the new Lady of Winterfell wields Oathkeeper, the sword once belonging to Jaime Lannister." Brienne felt an uncomfortable twist in her gut whenever Jaime's name arose. She had told no one the final truth of what had passed between them in those dark times at the war's end. But the memory haunted her. "Rumors travel faster than ravens, it seems," she said. "Yes, Oathkeeper is still in my possession, though I keep it out of sight more often than not. The North deserves to see a sword raised for its own cause, not a relic of old conflicts." The Maester nodded carefully. "I can draft a polite response if you like. And we can reassure Lord Manderley that all swords here are loyal to House Stark." He hesitated. "Or, well, to the Lady of Winterfell." She sank into the chair, ignoring the twinge of guilt that prodded her whenever Sansa's name was mentioned in conjunction with the seat that she had left behind. "Yes, please," she murmured. "And add that he is welcome. I will be honored by his presence." She paused, glancing at the Maester's face to gauge if there was more news, something unspoken. But he only bowed again and gathered his quill. She lingered for a moment longer, letting her eyes settle on a map of the region pinned to a board on the wall. She traced the outlines of the north, Bear Island to the west, the Dreadfort to the east. All the old houses, some in tenuous alliances, some loyal, some uncertain. She found it daunting, remembering the banners that had once marched under Robb Stark, the heartbreak that had followed. Now, the North was in a period of fragile regrowth, forging new alliances with the Crown and the southern kingdoms. And she, Brienne, sat at Winterfell's head. She stood, deciding that before she faced the day's politics, she would have at least a moment of solitude in the Godswood. Let the stillness of the ancient weirwood quell the tangle in her mind. The corridor leading to the Godswood door was drafty. Her cloak, lined with fox fur, swirled around her ankles as she stepped out into the open courtyard. The cold bit at her cheeks, and she exhaled a cloud into the frosty air. Guards posted at the gates offered her nods or murmured greetings. She returned them with a slight dip of her head, still not fully accustomed to their deference. As she approached the Godswood, the thick, woven branches of the ancient trees seemed to part like a silent invitation. Snow hushed her footfalls, and the crispness of the morning air felt sharper here. She passed the small pool, once a tranquil mirror of dark water. Now it was half frozen, the edges rimed with ice. The heart tree stood in its midst, the face carved into the pale bark, seeming to peer at her with that inscrutable calm. Red sap, like tears of blood, stained the wood's features. She paused a respectful distance away. In the quiet that only the godswood could hold, she let out a breath. Once, she would have prayed to the seven, the maiden, the warrior, the mother, the father, the smith, the crone, the stranger. But in the north, she had come to respect the old gods as well, to understand why Sansa found solace beneath their boughs, why Arya had once prayed here. The air felt alive with an ancient presence, not condemning or accepting, simply observing. Brienne bowed her head. She wished for guidance, some sign that she could keep Winterfell safe, that she would not fail the trust Sansa had placed in her. She wished for the clarity that came so much more easily with a sword in hand and an enemy on the field. Yet she knew now that the real battle was not always fought with steel. Power resided in loyalties, in daily negotiations, in the trust built between lord and vassal. And she stood at the center, with a title bestowed upon her by the rightful lady, but still uncertain how to weave herself into the tapestry of northern tradition. The wind rustled through bare branches, scattering a few flakes of snow from above. She thought she heard a whisper, but it was only the wind. Still, she lingered, lips parted as she exhaled, letting the hush calm her heart. After some time, she turned back. There was business to attend to, no matter how hesitant she felt. She left the godswood, crossing the courtyard again. The bustle of servants had increased. Some carried buckets of hot water from the well house. Others lugged crates of turnips and onions to the kitchens. A few children ran by with broomsticks in hand, giggling, until a stern stablemaster barked at them to keep out of the way. Near the armory, she saw a group of men practicing. One, a tall youth with a shock of red-brown hair, slashed at a straw dummy with near-frenzied energy. The others egged him on, giving half-mocking cheers. Brienne recognized him as the younger brother of a minor northern lord sworn to Winterfell. Cregan, she recalled the name. A brash boy, perhaps 15, who idolized knights of old songs. She hesitated, then stepped over to observe. The men noticed her approach and abruptly quieted. The boy froze mid-strike. Brienne was aware of the gaze of older soldiers, men who might have once served the Starks directly. She could sense their curiosity. Would their new lady scold the boy for playing at swords, or would she address them as a commander might? She leveled her calm gaze at the youth. "You hold your sword too loosely," she said in a gentle but authoritative tone. "When you swing, if your grip fails, you'll lose your blade before you land a second strike." Cregan blinked, eyes wide. "Yes, my lady," he managed, adjusting his hold. He seemed unsure whether to bow or stand at attention. She motioned for him to strike the dummy again. He did so with more control. "Better," she said. She stepped forward, took hold of the practice sword at its hilt, and showed him how to keep his wrist steady. "You mustn't rely on raw strength. Balanced technique, these are what keep you from leaving your guard open. A strong stance will protect you even if your enemy is heavier or taller." She demonstrated a shift in footing, the motion fluid despite her thick cloak. The boy and the gathered men watched with rapt attention. She remembered a time in the Stormlands when no one took her sword instructions seriously, when they scoffed at the notion of a tall, awkward girl instructing them. But here, though she saw flickers of surprise and a hint of doubt, she also saw respect. She stepped back and gestured for him to try again. He struck, more precise this time. The straw dummy's head shook with the force of the blow. He beamed, stepping back to see if she approved. "Train hard," Brienne said. "You'll improve in time." She handed the practice sword back to him. The older soldiers inclined their heads, and she returned a nod of her own before continuing on her path. It was a small moment, but it reminded her of the months she had spent at Sansa's side, the months of quiet lessons exchanged between them. She recalled Sansa once telling her she had never been encouraged to wield a blade, but she had found other ways to fight. Maybe the North was slowly learning that there were many shapes an able leader could take. Perhaps it helped that the memory of the war was fresh enough that a skilled fighter garnering authority did not seem as strange as it once might have. Inside the great hall, the morning meal was being laid out. Trenchers of bread, bowls of warm porridge with honey, eggs scrambled with onions, slices of ham. She could smell the savory scents from the moment she entered. The high table was set with simple crockery, though the Stark banners hung along the hall's length. The direwolf motif always reminded her of how strongly these people held to their legacy. She sat at the central seat, unsettled by the fact that it was once Ned Stark's seat, then Robb's, then Sansa's. Her own presence felt almost like an interloper. But she would honor them, respect the traditions, and do what she must. Some of the local lords and their families were present, either lodging at Winterfell or visiting on errands. She made sure to greet them politely, though she still felt more comfortable with a sword in her hand than a spoon. A few attempts at small talk were made, mostly about the lateness of the season's first heavy snowfall, or news of White Harbor's latest shipments. She responded with measured politeness, letting her instincts guide her as best she could. Lord Serwyn, a grizzled man with lines etched deeply in his face, nodded to her from across the table. "My lady, I've arranged for the extra timber you requested for repairing the storehouse roof. I've had men cutting in the eastern forests." She remembered the discussion about rotted beams near the storehouse. A leak had threatened to spoil some of the winter stores. "Thank you, Lord Serwyn," she said, meeting his eyes. "I appreciate the swift action." He acknowledged her thanks with a grunt. Perhaps once, he might have questioned the authority of a woman from Tarth. But the truth was, after the North's troubles, some saw in her the steadfast protector they needed. Others hid their doubts behind civility. Either way, she would prove herself through deeds, not lofty words. Her mind returned to the looming matter of the winter feast. The idea of hosting a feast as Lady of Winterfell had set her nerves on edge for days. Feasts were not just about food and merriment. They were about alliances, about demonstrating the strength and prosperity of the Lord's seat. She would have to preside over it, speak with each lord who arrived, assure them of Winterfell stability under her watch. That was politics, Sansa had explained. Each courtesy weighed and measured. She wished for simpler times, impossible times, when she was simply a knight on the road, guided by her oath to protect the innocent and aid those in need. But that was a dream of the past. Now she carried a heavier oath, safeguarding Winterfell, the seat of House Stark itself. Once she finished her breakfast, she pushed her trencher aside and stood. Servants began clearing the table as she made her way to the dais at the end of the hall. There, Robert Glover, a stocky man in middle years, was waiting for her with a respectful bow. "My lady, I've just come from speaking with the steward. He's uncertain about some of the livestock numbers and, well, we'd appreciate your guidance on how best to allocate resources. The steward worries we may not have enough feed if the snows worsen. We may need to cull some of the older cattle sooner than planned." "Nash," Brienne exhaled, recalling how Sansa had handled such concerns. She would gather all relevant counsel, stewards, head stable masters, local lords, discuss the matter, weigh the facts, and then decide. So, that was what Brienne would do. "Send for the steward," she said firmly. "We'll speak in the solar. Ask Maester Wallis to bring the account books. Then we'll decide." Neshri Moore. She turned, and behind her, the hall was beginning to thin as folk departed. Somewhere in the midst of the bustle, she caught a glimpse of Podrick Payne, her loyal squire. No, her loyal retainer now, for he was a man grown, and a knight in his own right if she had any say. He had chosen to stay by her side even when Sansa parted for King's Landing. He gave her an encouraging smile, as though to say, "You're doing fine." She inclined her head slightly in return. His presence was one of the few things that helped her keep her resolve. Making her way to the solar, she allowed a quiet moment to pass in her thoughts. She recalled the ghost of Jaime Lannister's voice, the gold of his hand that she had carried for a time, how he had once told her to do what she believed was right, no matter what the world thought of her. She hadn't always agreed with Jaime, but she had taken his final lessons to heart. She would not let the cynicism of others undermine her sense of duty or honor. She would stand tall, as she had on every battlefield. In the solar, Robert Glover, the steward, an older man named Cly, and Maester Wallis waited, the table spread with ledgers and rolls of parchment. The steward fiddled nervously with his spectacles, a southern style not often seen in the north, but apparently necessary for his fading eyesight. He cleared his throat. "My lady, I've examined our stores carefully. We've enough hay for the horses and enough feed for the cattle, unless the winter proves unusually harsh. The risk is that if the snows persist, delivering fresh feed from outlying farmland will be more difficult." "You know how?" Brienne eyed the maps. "You propose we cull older cattle, or those less likely to survive the cold, to conserve feed and keep the healthier livestock strong?" She had always disliked the idea of culling, but she understood the necessity. The North's winters were notorious. Clay nodded. "Yes, my lady. It may feel wasteful to slaughter them earlier, but the meat can be salted and stored. The hides can be used for leather. We'll lose less overall than if we let them die by starvation or cold." "Nader Swinen." She listened carefully, looking to Robert Glover. "And you concur?" He shrugged. "Aye, the steward's logic makes sense. The men in my service who oversee the farmlands say it's best to act sooner than later, or we'll be pinned by the heavy snows. We have to do it before the roads become impassable to transport the meat." Brienne let her gaze drift to the small window. The sky was gray, no sign of the sun. She thought of the many people who depended on Winterfell. Farmers, small folk, orphans, the old and infirm. "Then see it done," she said quietly. "But let's do it properly, with oversight. Ensure the best cattle remain, and that those we cull are processed fully. Nothing wasted." She felt the weight of command settle on her shoulders again. This was part of it, making decisions that affected lives, whether animal or human, in the name of survival. When she'd been a sworn sword, her duties were simpler. Defend the one she served. Fight the enemy. Now, every choice carried the potential to ripple across the entire region. Maester Wallace tapped his quill on the table. "I'll update the record books. My lady, we also received word from the blacksmiths that they could use additional charcoal. With the feast nearing, they'll be working longer hours, forging and repairing cooking spits, cutlery, and other necessities. They've asked for a larger allotment of wood for their kilns." "Miss Everbolgen." She suppressed a sigh, feeling the swirl of practicalities piling up. "Speak with them," she said. "Determine how much more is needed. Then ensure the woodcutters can spare enough without neglecting other vital areas." Such small details, she thought. But every detail held significance. She recalled Sansa once telling her that a single missed detail, a single small oversight, could cost a harvest or a life in the harsh north. They spoke for a while longer, going over each ledger, each matter that required her seal or final word. Outside, bells chimed once, marking an hour's passage. She forced herself not to rush, to give each subject the attention it merited. This was her duty now. At last they left, bowing respectfully. She sank back in the chair, exhausted by these mundane yet critical tasks. A soft knock roused her. It was Podrick, stepping into the solar with a polite bow. He was taller than he'd been, though his face still carried some youthful roundness. His hair was cropped short, and he bore a sword at his hip, newly forged steel, the hilt set with a single black stone. "My lady," he said, but she could sense his warmth beneath the formal address. "Are you well? I thought you could use a break." "I brought mulled wine." She gave a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Pod. A break would be welcome." "And son." He handed her a small wooden cup, and she sipped the steaming wine, the spices warming her tongue, the heat trickling down her throat. She let out a breath. "How are you finding Winterfell?" she asked. "Better than the road, I hope." Podrick shrugged shyly. "It's different, my lady. We never used to stay anywhere so long. I like the people here, though. And the northern men, some treat me kindly, others laugh, but that they do that anywhere, I suppose." She nodded, well aware of the scorn Podrick had faced in King's Landing for his inexperience and awkward manner. Yet he had proven his loyalty many times over. "You've proved yourself as a squire and a knight in all but name. If they laugh, let them. I know you'll show them your worth in time." He glanced around, then leaned in slightly, Are you truly all right? Being Lady of Winterfell is a lot. I can see it weighing on you. Brienne inhaled the wine's aroma. It is a burden, she said softly, but it's one I must bear. If Sansa trusts me with it, I'll not betray that trust. She believes in me. And perhaps the North will too, in time. Podrick nodded, admiration clear in his eyes. You'll do fine. You always do. Menacing Shras. She reached out and briefly squeezed his shoulder in thanks. Then, with a sigh, she pushed herself to her feet. I suppose I shouldn't linger too long, or I'll never leave this seat of papers and sums. Would you walk with me to the walls? I'd like some fresh air. He agreed at once, stepping aside to let her pass, then following her through the corridors. As they ascended the stone stairway leading to the battlements, a harsh wind greeted them, stirring Brienne's cloak and ruffling Podrick's hair. The view from atop Winterfell's walls was vast and austere. Miles of snow-draped fields and forests, a gray sky that pressed down like an endless lid over the land. The distant ring of steel below told her the men were still drilling. She spotted a few watchers on the wall, hunched against the cold, scanning the horizon for any threat. She moved slowly along the walkway, feeling the stone beneath her boots. Podrick kept pace, glancing at the few guards who saluted as they passed. She tried to imagine how many times Ned Stark had walked this very path, scanning for dangers from the south or beyond the wall. She thought of how Sansa used to come up here to catch glimpses of approaching travelers, waiting for word from beyond Winterfell's gates. She came to a stop at a corner tower, resting her hands on the crenellation. Snow dusted her hair and shoulders. Podrick stood beside her, silent. The wind whistled in their ears. At length, she spoke. I remember the first time I saw Winterfell, she said, voice thoughtful. It was after I'd heard the stories of the Stark children, of how they'd been scattered. I only had a single aim back then, to keep Lady Sansa safe, to fulfill my promise to her mother. The castle seemed both imposing and sad, as if it grieved with no lord or lady properly holding it. And now, I stand here, appointed as lady. Podrick's brow furrowed. Perhaps it was always waiting for someone with a pure heart, my lady. She let out a quiet laugh, tinged with bitterness. My heart is far from pure, Pod. I've killed. I've lied. I've chosen paths that led to suffering. But I've tried to do what was right. Maybe that's enough for these walls. He opened his mouth to reassure her, but a voice called from below. My lady. It was one of the guards, waving up at her. She lifted her hand to show she heard him. There's a messenger, the guard yelled, arrived from the Dreadfort. Says he bears urgent tidings. He's waiting in the courtyard. Her gaze flicked to Podrick. The Dreadfort, that seat once held by House Bolton, now under new leadership, pledged to peace, but the name alone still made many a northerner uneasy. We'll go down at once, she called back. She descended the steps, Podrick at her side. The courtyard was busier now, with more folk moving about, some clearing ice near the stables, others tending to the horses. A messenger in mud-spattered leathers stood near a steaming horse, a stable hand taking the bridle. The man had a thick fur hat and a heavy cloak, both caked with frost at the edges. His breath came in quick puffs. My lady, he greeted her, bowing low. I've traveled through the night at my lord's command. He extended a sealed letter. The seal was unfamiliar, though it had a sigil recognized by northern tradition. The flayed man had been replaced after House Bolton's fall, so she expected some sign of the new occupant. But the wax was a swirl of red, marred with a slight pattern. She looked at it, uncertain. Who is your lord? She asked carefully. He cleared his throat, as though bracing himself. Lord Gerald Slate, who was granted the Dreadfort by the king's decree after the Boltons were stripped of their lands. He sends word that his seat is under threat from raiders. He begs assistance from Winterfell. Benton. She studied the man's expression. He looked genuinely concerned. The North had known pockets of unrest, some loyal to old ways, some turned bandit. She took the letter, broke the seal, and read the hurried script. Indeed, it pleaded for men to be sent. claiming that a band of outlaws, possible remnants of Bolton's cruel followers, were terrorizing the border villages near the Dreadfort. The letter ended with a polite entreaty to the Lady of Winterfell to uphold her duty as the North's warden, to protect smaller seats from lawless threats. Brienne felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to ride out personally, sword in hand, to crush these outlaws. That was the straightforward solution, the way of the warrior. But she had responsibilities here as well, and sending a large force so close to Winter might weaken Winterfell's own defenses. She glanced at Podrick, who seemed to sense her dilemma. "My lady, what would you have us do?" the messenger asked, an anxious tremor in his voice. He might have come from the Dreadfort's new lord, but the old shadows of that place lingered. People were frightened. Brienne steeled herself. "I'll speak with my commanders," she said. "Take some warmth in the kitchens, rest your horse. We'll have an answer for you soon." She motioned to one of the guards. "See, this man is given food and a hot drink." He bowed again, grateful, and followed the guard away. Brienne stared after him, her thoughts churning. The duties of a liege lord, or lady, were not just about feeding her own people. They included protecting the North from threats and upholding justice. If Lord Gerald Slate truly faced rogue Bolton sympathizers, ignoring them would only allow the menace to grow, and the rest of the North could suffer as well. She turned to Podrick. "Fetch Sir Alden and Lady Mormont," she said, naming two of the most capable leaders of Winterfell's men-at-arms. "We'll meet in the Great Hall to discuss how best to respond, and—" she paused. "If we must send a contingent of soldiers, I may lead them myself. I'll not ask men to march into danger while I remain safe behind these walls." Podrick's eyes flickered. He nodded, though she could see the concern etched in his brow. "Yes, my lady," he said before hurrying off. Brienne looked up at the keep, at the ancient stone towers. She imagined the outlaws setting fire to small villages, terrorizing families who had survived a war only to face brutality anew. Anger flared in her chest. Lady or not, she was first and foremost a knight who had sworn to protect the innocent. In that moment, she felt a stab of certainty. She would do her duty, both as Lady of Winterfell and as Brienne of Tarth, the woman who had sworn to defend Sansa, to defend the North, to keep oaths that others discarded. She would not shy away from the battlefield. Perhaps that was what the North needed, a protector on the walls and in the field. She pulled her cloak tighter and felt the reassuring weight of Oathkeeper at her side. Sansa had once told her, a vow means nothing if it's not lived daily. She intended to live it every day until her last breath. She headed back inside, the swirl of wind tugging at her cloak, the snow drifting in small flurries at her feet. The day was young yet, and there was much to be done. She had an uneasy feast to plan and a potential campaign to organize. Her steps felt steadier now. She would show them all, every watchful northern lord, every doubter who questioned why a knight of Tarth should hold Winterfell, that honor and strength were not bound to bloodlines alone. In her heart, she whispered a quiet oath to the old gods and the seven alike, to all that she held sacred, to defend Winterfell, to keep Sansa's trust, and to let no harm befall those under her care. And in the swirl of rising wind, it seemed as though the old walls whispered back, acknowledging her vow with a silent, steadfast acceptance. "Gandai." Brienne turned from the courtyard, stepping through the arched doorway that led into the main keep. Her cloak trailed behind, scattering snowmelt along the stone floor. The air inside felt slightly warmer than before. The fires in the hearths had been fed with fresh logs, warding off the midday chill. Servants hurried past her, carrying folded linens or trays laden with bread and steaming broth. Their hushed greetings acknowledged her status, but she still saw the lingering surprise in the eyes of some. Lady of Winterfell or not, she remained a novelty in these halls. She climbed a short flight of steps to the chamber that had been hastily prepared for the day's council. The door stood half open, and within, she heard the quiet murmur of voices. When she entered, Sir Alden and Lady Mormont both bowed. Sir Alden was a slight man for a knight, with a stoic bearing and a well-trimmed beard. He had come from the Vale originally, part of the force Sansa had mustered in her final campaigns against the Boltons, and he had stayed on at Winterfell for want of service and a sense of duty. Lady Mormont, on the other hand, was tall, broad-shouldered, her hair in tight braids close to her skull. She wore a leather jerkin and bracers etched with the sigil of the bear. She was not the famed young Lyanna Mormont, who had once ruled Bear Island with ferocity beyond her years, but an older cousin who had taken leadership after a series of losses during the war. This Lady Mormont had proven herself just as resolute, if a touch more reserved. Between them stood Podrick, who bowed as Brienne approached. She settled her gaze on the pair, remembering their loyalty in recent months. If anyone could help her make sense of the Dreadfort's plea, it was these two. She took her seat at the head of a small wooden table. The logs in the brazier crackled softly, smoke drifting through the flue. A servant in the corner stood ready with a pitcher of water and a pot of warm ale, presumably in case the discussion went long. Sir Alden spoke first, his voice measured. "My lady, Podrick has told us of the message. If the new Lord Slate truly faces a threat of bandits, remnants of the Bolton men, or others with ill intent, we must assess how many fighters we can spare. Winterfell needs to remain protected, especially with the roads growing worse by the day." Brienne nodded, steepling her fingers. "We cannot ignore them, certainly. The letter suggests these outlaws are raiding villages and abducting villagers who resist. The Dreadfort's garrison might be too thin or inexperienced to handle it alone. Still, we can't leave Winterfell vulnerable." Lady Mormont shifted her weight. "Between my own warriors from Bear Island and the men raised by House Glover, we have a respectable force stationed here. We might dispatch a strong party under a trusted commander, but if the banditry is widespread, it won't be a simple matter of a single skirmish." Brienne considered the angles. A small group might be outmatched if the outlaws were more numerous or cunning than they appeared. A larger force would leave Winterfell exposed, though perhaps not dangerously so, if she left behind enough seasoned defenders. "I would not risk sending an underwhelming force," Brienne said, her voice resolute. "If we act, we must ensure success. Otherwise, we risk emboldening them, and the North cannot tolerate further chaos." Sir Alden leaned forward. "You've mentioned leading the troops yourself. Is that your final decision, my lady? The men would follow you without question, but your absence here would be deeply felt. Remember, Stannis." She cast her gaze momentarily to the floor, the old stone worn by countless feet before her. She recalled how she had once yearned for nothing more than to ride into danger to protect those under her care. Yet her station at Winterfell demanded she think beyond her old habits. "I must go," she said at last, though her tone was thoughtful rather than impetuous. "The new lord specifically calls upon Winterfell. If the Lady of Winterfell leads the relief, it will show these bandits, and all other would-be lawbreakers, that we stand united. Still, I don't intend to leave Winterfell undefended. I'll take a fraction of our forces, perhaps 100 or so, enough to deter any large group. Sir Alden, you'll remain here with the rest of the guard. Lady Mormont, if you're willing, I'd have you accompany me. Your presence will show the North that we come in force, that Bear Island stands with Winterfell in this cause." "Oh." Lady Mormont squared her shoulders, a faint flicker of pride in her eyes. "I would be honored, my lady. My sword is yours to command." Sir Alden inclined his head, though Brienne sensed a trace of concern in his expression. "As you will. I'll keep the garrison prepared. If you must send for reinforcements, I'll be ready." Podrick, standing quietly to one side, seemed to suppress a small grin of relief. She suspected he had worried she might leave him behind. She gave him a quick look that said she expected him to come, and he nodded with fervor. They spoke a while longer, discussing the logistics. The roads leading east were often treacherous once deep winter set in, but with only light snow so far, the trip might take a few days if they rode swiftly. They would bring provisions, traveling light, but carrying enough winter gear for nights camping on the road. The biggest question was whether the outlaws would stand and fight or melt into the wilderness, forcing a prolonged search. At last, Brienne stood, the meeting concluded. She felt both the weight and the clarity of the path ahead. This was the sort of challenge she understood. It was not that she preferred war over peace, but a straightforward threat could be confronted head-on in a way that subtler matters of governance could not. Before she left to oversee preparations, she paused in the corridor, noticing the swirl of commotion as the castle staff rushed about. Plans for the winter feast had been in full swing for weeks, and though no official date had been set, everyone knew it would be soon. Cooks fretted over storehouses, seamstresses scrambled to prepare banners, and stable hands readied the stables for visiting lords. Brienne realized that her departure might put a slight halt on these festivities, yet another ripple of her decisions. But better the feast be postponed or scaled back than to see the north fall into lawlessness. She pressed her lips together and continued on. At the yard, she found the master-at-arms, a stern-faced man named Hoster, drilling with a handful of recruits. As she approached, he dismissed the recruits with a curt nod so he could speak privately with her. "My lady, I've heard talk we're sending forces east. What do you require of me?" She explained the plan. A contingent of about 100 soldiers, half on horseback, half foot, accompanied by Lady Mormont's men. Hoster listened intently, occasionally scratching the stubble on his chin, the ring of keys at his belt jingling with each movement. "I can have them ready by first light tomorrow," he assured her. "We'll have to handpick the ones most fit for a fast march in winter conditions. Some of the older men might not manage well on the road." She agreed. "Make certain they're equipped with furs, sturdy boots, enough supplies to weather a few nights in the open if need be. We'll likely not want to drag wagons through the snow if we can avoid it, so pack only essentials. Speed is crucial." "Ronde." He bowed, the movement somewhat awkward in his worn leather jerkin. "At once, my lady. You'll have your company." She watched him stride off, bellowing orders to gather men. Somewhere in that throng she spotted Podrick again, already speaking with a few men about their readiness. She felt a small swell of pride at how far he'd come from the timid boy in King's Landing. There was another matter to handle. The messenger from the Dreadfort needed an answer to bring back. Brienne crossed the yard to the kitchens, where she expected he might be resting and warming up. The smell of spiced cabbage and roasting meat drew her in. The kitchens were large, with a high ceiling and long wooden tables strewn with vegetables waiting to be chopped. A roaring fire in the massive stone oven kept the place alive with heat, almost too much for a place so cold beyond its walls. She found the messenger seated on a bench, clutching a half-empty cup of broth. He leapt up when he saw her, nearly spilling the remaining liquid. "My lady," he began, bowing. She motioned for him to sit. "You must be weary from your journey. I won't keep you long. Let me give you my reply to Lord Slate." He set his cup aside and reached for a bit of parchment from within his vest, ready to record. She studied his face. Beneath the grime from travel, he looked young, perhaps 22, far too young to have seen the horrors that had plagued the North. She spoke clearly, making sure each word was measured. "Tell your lord that the Lady of Winterfell will ride east at dawn with a contingent of 100 knights and men-at-arms, joined by Lady Mormont's warriors. We will come to his aid and root out these bandits. He must hold fast for a few more days. We'll coordinate our efforts upon arrival." The messenger's eyes lit with relief. "Yes, my lady. He'll be grateful. The villages along the Weeping Water have suffered enough. They'll be glad to see your banners." "Bentown?" Brienne frowned inwardly at the mention of the Weeping Water, an appropriately grim name for a region that had once been under Bolton rule. She nodded to the messenger. "Finish your broth, then rest. Take a fresh horse from our stables when you depart, and safe travels back." He thanked her profusely, bowing again and again until she left him to his meal. It was a small courtesy to give him a horse, but also practical. Faster travel meant quicker assistance. Out in the corridor again, the heat of the kitchens gave way to the biting chill. She pulled her cloak tighter, trying to ignore the ache in her shoulders. The day had been long, but it was not yet over. She retired briefly to her solar, where Maester Wiles was tidying the parchments from earlier. He eyed her curiously as she entered. "My lady," he said gently, "might I guess from your expression that you intend to leave soon?" She sank onto the chair behind the table. "8 dawn tomorrow. I'd like you to remain vigilant here. Keep an eye on any ravens from the south or from the Dreadfort. Should anything unexpected arise, inform Sir Alden. If it's urgent, I want to know. I'll have a raven with me so messages can find me, though it may be slower. Nast. He inclined his head, fingertips pressed together. Of course, my lady. I'll keep the records. And, if I may say, though you are new to your station, the men speak of your resolve with admiration. She felt a slight warmth on her cheeks. Thank you, Maester. I'll do my best to prove worthy of that admiration. He bowed and exited, leaving her alone in the solar. The silence hung there, settled like a fine dust. She glanced at the map on the wall again. Her fingers traced the route they would take. A thin line marking the roads from Winterfell to the Dreadfort. The distance was not too great, but in these conditions, each mile could be grueling. She thought again of the outlaws. Her mind turned to the cruelty of the Boltons. What seeds of brutality might remain among their disbanded men? The tension tightened in her chest. She considered writing a letter to Sansa, explaining that she was leaving Winterfell's walls to fulfill a duty, but realized there was no time for a raven to fly to King's Landing and back with Sansa's blessing. Sansa would not begrudge her this choice anyway. Brienne knew her too well. She could almost hear Sansa's voice in her mind. Go, protect our people. She rose again, forcing her weariness aside, and made her way to her chamber to prepare. Inside, a servant had freshened the furs on her bed and tidied her belongings. Her armor stood on a wooden stand near the hearth. The polished steel of her greaves, her breastplate, the fine detail on the vambraces that still bore faint traces of Tarth heraldry. She had never quite replaced them with stark imagery, though she sometimes felt the pull to do so. She ran a hand over the breastplate, remembering the many battles it had seen. She would need something warmer beneath it. Quilted doublet, thick breeches, a new gambeson lined with fur. She recalled how the cold of the north seeped through metal like a biting ghost. If one was not adequately layered. She reached for a cleaning rag to wipe away any smudges. Methodically, she checked each strap, each buckle, ensuring nothing had worn thin or cracked. Then she set it aside on a small table, ready for the morning. Oathkeeper's scabbard hung on a peg near the bed. She unhooked it, drawing the blade partway. The rippling steel glinted in the firelight. She heard echoes of Jaime's voice, the day he had gifted the blade to her. It's reforged from ice, Ned Stark's sword. Keep it safe. Keep the oath. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the swirl of grief and respect bound up with that memory. Then she slid the blade home, set it across the bed, and breathed in slowly. A knock came at the door. Enter, she called. Podrick stepped in, carefully shutting the door behind him. He looked at her gear, the bed, then back to her. My lady, he began. I've done as you asked. I helped select men for the company, mostly younger ones who want struggle in the cold. A handful of veterans are coming too, for leadership in each squad. She nodded. Thank you. That's precisely what we need. He hesitated, as though there was more on his mind. If it pleases you, I'd like to ride near the vanguard. I want to be of real service in the event of a fight. I won't hold you back. Memnator Kawain. Brienne understood the unspoken concern. The front lines would be dangerous, but Podrick had fought before, facing even the undead legions that had once threatened Winterfell. He had acquitted himself bravely, though he'd come out shaken and changed like so many others. I know you're capable, Podrick, she said softly. You'll be with me when we face these outlaws. Just remember your training. Relief blossomed on his face. Yes, my lady, he said, bowing again. We'll keep watch through the night, then set out at dawn. She stepped forward and rested a hand on his shoulder. Pod, she said, letting her voice be warm. In many ways you are like a brother or a son to me. There's no one I trust more at my side in battle. His cheeks reddened slightly, but his eyes glowed with pride. Thank you. I'll not disappoint you. He left soon after, leaving her in the hush. She stared after him, thinking of all the roads they had traveled, from the war-torn riverlands to the rocky coasts of the Vale, from King's Landing to the snows of the north. Sometimes it felt as though fate had bound them together for reasons neither fully understood. She was grateful for it. She spent the next hour in near silence, occasionally rousing herself to sort through winter provisions, a thick woolen cloak for the journey, extra gloves, and small personal items. Despite her new position, she had never grown used to delegating such tasks. She prided herself on readiness. Only when her eyes felt heavy did she realize how late it had grown. At supper, the great hall was half full. Word had spread of her plan, and there was a charged excitement in the air. Soldiers who would remain behind eyed those selected to ride out with a mixture of envy and relief. Servants speculated on how long the expedition might last, and whether Lady Brienne might return victorious in time to preside over the winter feast. The aroma of roasted venison and pottage filled the hall, but Brienne's appetite was minimal. She forced herself to eat enough to keep up her strength, mindful that tomorrow's ride could be taxing. She offered a few words to the men around her, reminding them to be prepared for early departure. She tried to project confidence, though inside her mind churned with concerns. Yet, seeing the soldiers straighten their shoulders under her gaze reminded her that leadership meant giving courage even when one held doubts. She recalled what Sansa had once told her. Sometimes a leader must be the pillar others lean on, even if that pillar trembles within. After supper, she retired earlier than usual, making certain everything was ready. She snuffed out the candle by her bedside and lay down, fully aware sleep might elude her. The wind outside keened softly against the ancient stones. Her thoughts drifted to the cold roads ahead, to the faces of frightened villagers waiting for relief. She found a sense of resolve in that image, and eventually weariness won out. Dawn came with a pale wash of light across a sky choked by low clouds. In the courtyard, a swirl of preparation greeted her. Horses snorted in the frosty air, breath pluming in thick white streams. Men hastily packed saddlebags with dried meats, water skins, and all manner of winter gear. Lady Mormont arrived in a heavy fur cloak, flanked by half a dozen of her Bear Island warriors, each sporting the distinctive emblem of the bear on their jerkins or shields. They offered Brienne respectful nods. She donned her armor, piece by piece, with a confidence earned from a lifetime of practice. The breastplate's weight felt familiar. Oathkeeper hung at her side. Over it all, she wore a thick, dark cloak lined with fur at the collar. She tested her horse's bridle, ensuring the beast was calm and fed. Winterfell's stablemaster, a taciturn fellow named Jory, handed her the reins. "He's a strong one, my lady," Jory said. "Should handle the cold well enough." Brienne stroked the horse's flank and mounted. The soldiers formed up in rows across the courtyard, some bearing the Stark sigil, others the sigils of their minor houses. A few banners fluttered in the faint wind, though the day was still enough to keep them from full display. She saw Podrick sitting astride his own mount just behind her, looking both solemn and determined. Lady Mormont had a fine gray mare, and her warriors stood clustered around her. Sir Alden emerged, accompanied by Maester Ways and a scattering of onlookers. Stewards, servants, younger members of lesser houses. All had come to watch Winterfell's lady depart. Brienne guided her horse forward, surveying the assembled men. She recognized the same anxious excitement in their faces that she had felt in herself so many times. She inhaled, the chill air burning in her lungs. "For Winterfell," she said, voice clear. "And for the north." A few of them repeated the words. Then, with a nudge of her heels, she led the column out through the gatehouse, past the thick walls, and onto the open road. The sky was muted, a dull gray that threatened more snow at any moment. They rode at a steady pace, not quite a gallop. The path was relatively clear, though patches of ice forced them to keep watch. The men on foot marched in step, boots crunching the hard ground. As the fortress receded behind them, Brienne looked back once. Winterfell's walls jutted from the whitened landscape, silent and strong. She made a silent promise to return it in as safe a state as she left it, or safer. Then she turned her gaze ahead. They progressed throughout the morning, passing farmsteads whose fields lay fallow under a blanket of frost. Smoke curled from the rooftops of the huts, and the occasional villager peered from a doorway as the party marched by. A few offered timid waves. Brienne wondered if rumors of the new lady's expedition had already trickled out, or if they simply recognized a large armed company traveling east. Lady Mormont rode beside her, their horses keeping pace. The older woman's breath emerged in visible puffs as she spoke. The last time I rode these roads in winter was during the war. Dark times. I never thought I'd see a day when House Mormont answered the call of a Tarth to defend the Dreadfort. Fate is full of surprises. Brienne glanced at her. I don't relish aiding the Dreadfort, considering its history, but I'd sooner see it in the hands of a decent lord than the Boltons. They caused enough suffering. Mormont's jaw tightened. My nieces fought and died against Ramsay Bolton. House Mormont won't forget the cruelty that place once harbored. But if new leadership is earnestly trying to do right by the North, we can't let outlaws terrorize them. Never. They fell into a pensive silence, broken only by the steady thud of hooves. Occasionally, a scout would ride back and forth along the column, reporting on the terrain ahead. As midday approached, they paused only to let the horses drink from a half-frozen stream where water trickled below the crusted ice. Podrick dismounted, stamping his feet to restore warmth, and approached Brienne. "My lady, the men say we should reach the King's Road by late afternoon. We could camp near the Crossroad Inn if it's still operational." Brienne nodded. "That inn's been rebuilt a few times. Last I heard it was functional, though likely sparse. We'll see if there's lodging enough for the men. If not, we'll make camp outside. Either way, we won't push on in the dark." They pressed forward, each mile seeming longer as the cold seeped into joints and muscle. Once or twice, Brienne noticed curious travelers or small folk along the roadside, but none approached their company. The winter gloom dulled the colors of the land, making everything appear in shades of gray and white. In that dreariness, the spatter of horses' hooves was the only consistent sound aside from occasional snorts or the jingle of bridles. By dusk, they came upon the crossroads. A signpost, half buried in snow, marked directions to various towns and holdfasts. The inn, a squat wooden structure, stood nearby, smoke trailing from its chimney. A lantern burned weakly by the door. There was enough space in an attached stable for only a handful of horses, so the majority of the party set up tents around the grounds. A few men went inside to negotiate with the innkeeper for stew or ale. Brienne slid off her horse, wincing at the stiffness in her legs. She handed the reins to a soldier and cast a quick glance around. The men were already pitching tents, their breath forming ghostly clouds as they hammered stakes into the frozen earth. The camaraderie of soldiers on the march suffused the air. Hushed jokes, curses at stiff knots in rope, someone humming a half-forgotten song. Lady Mormont dismounted as well, rolling her shoulders. "We'll keep sentries around the perimeter," she said. "Best not to grow complacent." Brienne agreed. She checked in with Podrick, who had found a spot for her tent. He had directed men to build a small fire nearby. Already the scent of burning wood drifted on the air. She could almost taste the smoky tang. When she entered the inn, she found a cramped common room with a few battered tables. The innkeeper, a round man with a patchy beard, greeted her with a bob of his head. His eyes were wide as he took in her armor, her height. She requested a large cauldron of stew be made available for as many men as the kitchen could serve. He looked overwhelmed, but nodded, eager to secure the coin. She tried to pay him up front, but he refused, insisting it was better to wait until he saw how much they ate. "These roads haven't seen such a force in years," he explained nervously. "Folk will talk about this for months." Brienne offered a tight smile. "We hope to do some good," she said simply. Then she stepped aside to let the men shuffle in for warmth and food. She found a quiet corner near the hearth, propping her sword against the wall, the heat of the fire licking at her legs. Lady Mormont joined her. The inn's lanterns cast a dim glow across Mormont's face, highlighting the lines that spoke of countless hardships. They spoke little at first, each sipping from mugs of watered-down ale. Eventually, Mormont broke the silence. "This is your first major campaign as Lady of Winterfell. Are you uneasy about it?" "No." Brienne set her mug down, the wooden surface thudding on the table. "I'd be a fool not to feel some apprehension. I've led smaller groups before, but never under a banner like this." She glanced at the crowded room, at the men glancing her way from time to time, curious to see how their new leader would conduct herself. "I made a vow to protect Sansa and to protect the North if ever it needed me. This feels right, but I worry I might misstep, might fail them." Mormont's stare was direct but not unkind. "You're worried about failing, which means you're less likely to fail." The ones who never doubt themselves are often the first to march off a cliff. Brienne let a slight smile curve her lips. Thank you. That's a comfort. In a northern sort of way. Mormont huffed a quiet chuckle. We do our best. And though some might question a Tarth holding Winterfell, they can't question your honor. Honor is something the North respects, no matter whose blood runs through your veins. They fell into companionable silence again. The wind rattled against the shutters, and the sounds of men eating filled the space. A few rowdy soldiers laughed at some jest, but they kept their merriment subdued, mindful of the somber duty ahead. Eventually, Brienne rose to check on the men outside. The sky had darkened fully, and snow began falling in small icy flakes, swirling in the wind. Torchlight danced in pockets around the campsite, illuminating tents in a flickering orange haze. Sentries paced along the perimeter, cloaked against the cold. She moved among them, stopping to offer quiet words of encouragement. She noticed one man, a recruit from White Harbor, shivering under his cloak, teeth chattering. She knelt beside him, adjusting the clasp on his cloak to cover more of his neck. Better? She asked. He managed a grateful nod. Yes, my lady. Thank you. These small gestures reminded her of the nights she had spent in bitter cold, alone on the road, with no one to look out for her, but herself. She had survived then, and she would help these men survive now. She returned to her tent, finding it cramped but marginally warmer inside. A brazier with a small fire glowed in one corner, guarded so the canvas wouldn't catch flame. Podrick was already there, feeding another piece of wood into it, his own cloak dusted with snow. You should rest, Brienne told him gently. We'll have another long day's ride tomorrow. He nodded, yawning. Yes, my lady. Brienne removed her breastplate, setting it carefully on a stand. She folded herself onto a bedroll. Even with furs beneath her, the ground felt hard and unyielding. But it was better than many nights she had known. She pulled her cloak tight around her shoulders, letting the warmth of the brazier lull her. The faint murmur of voices outside, the crackle of fire, the sting of cold in her lungs, these sensations stirred old memories of past campaigns. Yet this time, she bore the weight of responsibility for all these souls. Sleep came slowly, tangled in the tension of leadership. Morning dawned gray once more, the world muffled by a layer of fresh snow. The men stirred to life with the clank of pots and the rustle of tent flaps. Brienne rose and reassembled her armor. She shared a brief meal of dried fruit and bread, washing it down with cold water that made her teeth ache. Lady Mormont was already up, directing her Bear Island warriors to strike camp. Podrick performed a final check on the horses, ensuring none had taken ill overnight. They set out again, the road more difficult to traverse under the new snow. Their pace slowed, forcing them to distribute some belongings among the foot soldiers, so the horses weren't overburdened. Clouds hung low, threatening more snow at any moment. Occasionally, Brienne glanced upward, bracing herself for a sudden storm. But for the time being, the weather merely lingered in a menacing lull. As they moved east, the land began to slope slightly, dotted with skeletal trees that formed patches of sparse woodland. The branches were coated in white, the trunks black against the winter backdrop. Silence reigned, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of hooves and footsteps. A few crows took flight overhead, cawing as they disappeared into the gray sky. Around midday they came across the first signs of trouble. A small hamlet, no more than a few huts with thatched roofs, showed blackened timbers and collapsed walls. The men grew quiet, halting their march at the edge of the ruined structures. Brienne dismounted slowly, surveying the scene. Spread out, she ordered. Look for survivors or clues. The huts looked as though they had been burned from the inside, though the snow had doused any lingering embers. She approached one, stepping over scorched beams. Inside, the remains of a rudimentary hearth lay in ash. A faint stench of char lingered. She knelt and touched the blackened earth, the soot staining her gauntlet. Podrick appeared at her side, shaking his head grimly. No sign of anyone living. We found tracks, my lady, but the snowfalls obscured them. A few footprints near the main path. Could be from days ago. Lady Mormont joined them. We found the remains of livestock in a pen out back. all slaughtered. No sign of the villagers. A hollow feeling settled in Brienne's stomach. The cruelty was too reminiscent of the Bolton era. She stood, her breath hissing through clenched teeth. "We press on," she said, "but be on guard. These outlaws may be near, or they may have moved on." "Now," they continued, a somber tension gripping the company. Now the men rode with hands closer to their sword hilts, eyes scanning the tree lines. The rest of the day brought more evidence of raids, broken fences, trampled gardens, footprints half frozen in slush. They passed another hamlet that seemed abandoned but not burned, as though its inhabitants had fled at the first hint of violence. Brienne ordered her scouts to ride out in small groups ahead, seeking any fresh trails. They made camp that evening in a sheltered hollow near a thin creek. Trees surrounded them, their branches creaking in the wind. A sentry who had gone to gather firewood returned with a grim face. "I found a body," he reported to Brienne, "frozen stiff near the creek. It looked like a farmhand, but no pack or coins. Likely robbed." She listened, trying to maintain composure. "We'll bury him come morning," she said softly, "or at least see he's laid to rest in a manner befitting the old gods." Through the night, the wind rose, howling around their tents. Brienne slept in short, fitful spans, images of the scorched hamlet dancing behind her eyelids. She thought of the promises she had made to protect the people of the north. The next morning they carried the body a little ways off and buried it beneath a pine, with Lady Mormont leading a brief prayer to the old gods. The ground was frozen, forcing the men to chip away at it with picks before they could dig deep enough. Each strike of metal on earth was a harsh reminder that the north in winter gave nothing easily. They rode on, cresting a small ridge by midday. There, at last, they glimpsed a sprawl of land that marked the approach to the Dreadfort's domain. The shape of the fortress itself was not yet visible, but a cluster of ravens circling in the distance suggested more tragedy awaited them. Brienne's heart sank. She urged her horse forward, the company trailing behind. Not an hour later, they encountered a patrol from the Dreadfort. Half a dozen men led by a grim-faced captain wearing the new lord's colors. They eyed the Winterfell banner with cautious relief. One of them recognized Lady Mormont, bowing to her. The captain, who introduced himself as Naren, looked exhausted. His cheeks were hollow, his clothes spattered with mud. "My lady," he said, addressing Brienne, "thank the gods you've come. These bastards have been striking small villages all around. Lord Slate is mustering what men he can, but the Dreadfort's garrison is smaller than we'd like." Brienne dismounted to speak with him more closely. "We found burned homes and slain villagers along the way. Do you have any idea how many outlaws we're dealing with? Is there a single group or multiple bands?" Naren's expression darkened. "It's hard to say. They strike quickly, vanish into the forests. Some survivors say they fly no banner, but their leader is rumored to bear the flayed man's sigil hidden beneath a ragged cloak, as if clinging to the old Bolton ways. We suspect that they're scattered remnants of Ramsay's men, or opportunists using that legacy to sow fear. Perhaps both. We've had reports of 30, maybe 40 total, but they may have..." Brienne gritted her teeth, fury kindling at the thought that anyone would resurrect the terror of House Bolton. "We'll ride to the Dreadfort," she said. "Confer with Lord Slate. Then we'll help hunt these outlaws, root them out for good." Naren bowed, relief evident. "We'll guide you there. It's not far now." She remounted, the men forming ranks again. The patrol led them along a winding, half-overgrown trail. Eventually, they crossed a narrow river, its banks frozen at the edges. Beyond stood the Dreadfort, dark, imposing walls of gray stone, its towers reaching into the bleak sky. Brienne felt an involuntary chill at the sight. Memories of the Boltons' atrocities stirred in the back of her mind. Once, she had heard stories of dungeons inside those walls that echoed with screams. Now, banners of a newly minted sigil hung limply over the gates, a token sign of change. As they approached, the portcullis rose. A handful of archers stood watch on the battlements, tension clear in their posture. The courtyard beyond was small compared to Winterfell's, but busy with men-at-arms hurriedly preparing defenses, stacking crates, checking weapons, fitting arrowheads. Lord Slate himself emerged from a side door. He was a lean man, perhaps in his late 40s, with dark hair streaked by gray, and a lined face that spoke of worry and little sleep. He wore a worn doublet bearing an adapted sigil. A crimson tower, perhaps, replacing the flayed man. He swept a courteous bow. "Lady Brienne of Tarth. Lady of Winterfell. You honor us with your presence. I wish the circumstances were not so dire." She dismounted, stepping forward with measured dignity. "Lord Slate, I'm sorry for the troubles plaguing your lands. We've come to offer the North's aid, as requested." "Anan." He exhaled, clearly relieved by the sight of her forces. "Thank you, my lady. Let us talk within where we can plan. The men will see to your horses and your company. We have limited accommodations, but we'll do our best." She nodded, sparing a glance at Lady Mormont, who returned a brief, reassuring nod. Then she followed Slate into the Dreadfort's main hall. The stone walls were cold and dark, the floor covered by worn rushes. Torches flickered, casting shifting shadows. The ghosts of the old Bolton cruelty seemed to linger everywhere in the hush of those corridors. Brienne forced herself to remain calm, remembering that this was a new lord, trying to break free from that horrific legacy. In the hall, a long table had been set up with maps and scattered reports. A few of Slate's advisors stood by, fidgeting with worry. Slate gestured to the table. "We've tried to mark the sites of attacks." He pointed to a rough map, indicating several points across the region. "The outlaws move unpredictably, but they seem to focus on undefended hamlets. Whenever I send a patrol, they slip away or lure us into a chase, then ambush from the trees." Brienne studied the map, Lady Mormont leaning over her shoulder. Podrick stood behind them both. She tapped one point. "This hamlet burned to the ground 2 nights ago. We saw the remains yesterday." Her mouth tightened. "They're systematically terrorizing your people, likely to undermine your rule, as well as any notion that the Boltons are gone." Slate rubbed his eyes. "Yes. My father served House Stark before the war, though not prominently. The crown granted us these lands to ensure the Bolton line was truly at an end, but now it's as if that cursed sigil still haunts these walls." Brienne turned to Lady Mormont. "We'll have to split into smaller groups, track them through the forests. My main force can't outrun them if they're scattering, but that's dangerous. We'd be inviting ambush." Mormont's face was grim. "It might be the only way. We can coordinate sweeps, watch the roads, corner them." Slate nodded. "We have a few loyal trackers, men who know the woods well. They've tried, but the bandits are cunning. With your added strength, though, we might stand a chance." "One." Brienne took a steadying breath. She recalled the letter she had once written to Sansa, detailing her vow to defend the North. This was the test of that vow. "We will plan carefully," she said, laying her palm on the map, "and we will end this." The men around the table exchanged cautious, hopeful glances. Lord Slate's weary eyes shone with a glimmer of optimism. Outside, the wind whistled against the dark walls of the Dreadfort, as if protesting any notion of peace. Brienne stood firm, Oathkeeper at her side, resolved that no matter how cold and grim this fortress might be, she would bring the protection she had promised. The old ghosts of the Bolton name would not prevail here. Not while she drew breath. Amen. The hall had fallen silent after Brienne's declaration, and the torchlight danced across the worn stone walls in a pattern as restless as the thoughts in her mind. She stood at the table a moment longer, feeling the weight of gazes upon her. Lord Slate's men stared with hope and desperation, as if she might conjure an instant solution simply by setting her gauntleted hand on the map. Outside, the wind rattled against the shutters, and distant voices echoed through the corridors, a low hum of worry that seeped through the fortress. At last, Brienne lifted her gaze to Lord Slate. His eyes were sunken from nights of little sleep, and the lines at his brow showed the strain of trying to hold order against a foe that flitted through the cold forests like phantoms. She respected him for not abandoning his people, even if fear crept into every corner of his seat. She remembered how many lords before him had shown far less resolve when faced with true danger. She spoke quietly, as if to keep the gloom from amplifying her voice too much. "We will coordinate immediate sweeps. Gather your best trackers and woodsmen. Lady Mormont and I have brought 100 men from Winterfell, plus her Bear Island warriors. We'll divide them into smaller groups, no more than 15 or 20 in each, to flush out the outlaws where they hide. We can't afford to march as one large host and allow them to slip away." Lord Slate let out a shaky breath. "There are pockets of forest thick with undergrowth. If they know those paths better than we do, they could set ambushes. We've lost good men to hidden archers." Brienne's jaw tensed. She had known such tactics in the Riverlands, where bandits used every advantage. Now, with the snows and the unending shadows under the pines, it would be doubly dangerous. "We'll need to move methodically," she said. "We'll scour each region, flush them into an open area if we can. Perhaps we can corner them against the weeping water if they try to flee. Meanwhile, you keep the bulk of your remaining garrison here to defend. They may try to strike the Dreadfort if they sense we've weakened it." "Monsieur, no." He nodded, rubbing a hand over his chin. "I'll leave my most trusted men to guard the keep. The rest will join your sweeps. But if they anticipate a large-scale hunt, might they scatter entirely?" Lady Mormont frowned, leaning on the table. They might. But with winter looming, outlaws can't survive long in the deep woods without stealing supplies. If we disrupt their ability to raid, they'll either starve or try to gather in one place to mount a defense." She straightened, eyes flicking to Brienne. "Either way, we catch them." Lord Slate's captain, a man with a grizzled beard and a fresh scar across his temple, stepped forward. "There's an abandoned mill near the river. The outlaws were spotted around there a few days past, using it as a makeshift camp. Some of our men went to investigate, but they were driven back by archers. We lost one man, had 2 wounded." He swallowed hard, as if replaying it in his mind. "We suspect they might return there, given the vantage it provides." Brienne found the spot on the map. A little mark scrawled with the words, "River Mill Toy." She traced a line from the Dreadfort to that area. "That could be our first target," she said. "It's close enough for a dawn strike if we ride out tomorrow. I'd like a dozen of your local men to guide us. Anyone who knows the lay of the land. Lady Mormont, you and I can lead that raid ourselves." Lady Mormont nodded firmly. "Agreed. The rest of our forces can begin separate sweeps on the surrounding forests." "Miss." Podrick, who had hovered near the edge of the group, cleared his throat gently. "My lady, if the mill is heavily defended, we should consider approaching under cover of darkness, or setting an ambush ourselves. Are we sure we can mount a direct assault?" Brienne glanced at him, considering. "We'll evaluate the position before committing to a frontal attack. I won't lead our men into a death trap. The advantage is ours in numbers and discipline, but only if we're careful." Lord Slate's captain drew a deep breath. "We can show you the best approach. The path along the river is choked with brush. The area to the north is swampy, less accessible in winter, but possibly passable if the ground's frozen enough." He paused. "Though if they see us coming, they'll have time to scatter." Brienne nodded. "Then we must move swiftly." She turned back to Lord Slate, a note of reassurance in her voice. "Trust that we've dealt with bandits before. Though these men call themselves Bolton loyalists, or wear that sigil in secret, I don't care about their claims of legitimacy. They're murderers, and we'll treat them as such." "Nin? Die." Lord Slate inclined his head. "Thank you, my lady, and be careful. I can't abide more good folk lost to these devils." They concluded the meeting, leaving the table strewn with marked maps and old war reports. Brienne stepped out of the hall and into a corridor with high, narrow windows set in the thick stone. The air within the Dreadfort was damp and cold, as if the walls had never fully rid themselves of centuries of dread. At least in Winterfell, the hot springs lent a measure of warmth. Here, the chill sank right into one's bones. Torches sputtered in iron sconces, casting restless shadows that reminded her of how Ramsay Bolton's cruelty had once overshadowed the entire North. As she walked, she tried to push away the stories she'd heard, the tales of hunts more wicked than any bandit chase. It amazed her that after all the wars and all the purges, there still remained those twisted enough to cling to the flayed man. She tightened her fists, vow firm in her mind. This time, it would end. She passed a doorway leading to a bleak courtyard, where some of her men waited. She could see Podrick standing near the gate, speaking in low tones with a few of the Dreadfort soldiers. His breath plumed in the cold. She admired how calmly he carried himself now, offering advice and receiving reports. She recalled the shy squire he had been, wide-eyed at every new responsibility. Now he was a reliable right hand, and she allowed herself a faint smile. She returned to the main yard, where the combined forces of Winterfell, Bear Island, and the Dreadfort mingled under a pale midday sun. Small fires had been lit for warmth, and the men huddled around them in cloaks of wolf fur or bear hides. Lady Mormont was near one of these fires, her arms folded across her chest, listening to one of her lieutenants. When she spotted Brienne, she dismissed the lieutenant and stepped closer. She spoke in a low voice, so the men wouldn't overhear. "We'll ride to the mill with about 30 men at dawn, yes? A quick strike. If we're lucky, we'll catch them unprepared." Brienne nodded. "I want to review the area with the captain first, see what vantage we have. But yes, that's my thought. We'll need an even split of archers and swords, or close to it. Let's not rely on pure steel if they're dug in." "No," Mormont grunted. "They won't stand a chance if it's only a few dozen outlaws, but if their leader is canny, we might be dealing with deeper tricks. I've heard of bandits setting traps or illusions to draw us away. We must be ready for anything." Brienne glanced around, noticing how the Bear Island warriors carried themselves with quiet confidence. Even though they were fewer in number than the Winterfell men, she could see the grit in their eyes. She felt a stir of gratitude for Lady Mormont's unwavering support. "I trust your judgment in battle, my lady. Tomorrow we'll move as one." That evening, a simple meal was laid out in the Dreadfort's hall. Barley stew, roasted roots, and a bit of salted fish. Though it was meager fare, it sustained the men. Brienne ate only enough to keep her strength, her thoughts fixed on the assault at dawn. Lord Slate had offered her quarters in the keep, but she chose to sleep among her men in the lesser hall. She preferred to be easily accessible should any urgent matter arise. She found a corner where a few straw pallets had been placed, separated by thin blankets. The wind moaned through the cracks, making the torches flicker. Podrick unrolled a bedroll next to hers, setting his sword carefully within reach. She noticed the determined set of his jaw. "Are you worried about tomorrow?" she asked softly. He met her eyes. "I'm more worried about the men than myself. We've seen what happens when an enemy relies on fear tactics. If the outlaws are cornered, they might do something desperate." She nodded. "Desperate men can be the most dangerous, but I won't let them slip away. We'll end this." Her tone was resolute, but she couldn't deny the small flicker of anxiety in her chest. She had been on countless campaigns, but this was her first as Lady of Winterfell, commanding not only her own life, but the fate of an entire region. The North watched her, perhaps not physically, but with hearts and minds. She would not fail them. She lay down, pulling her cloak close against the chill. The voices of soldiers drifted around her, a quiet murmur that eventually surrendered to the hush of the long night. She dozed fitfully, haunted by images of charred huts and half-buried corpses, the smoky swirl of that Bolton sigil rising like a nightmare behind her eyelids. She woke well before dawn, though the sky outside remained ebony. She rose, careful not to rouse Podrick, and stepped into the courtyard. The cold was profound, a biting wind that crept under her cloak. Snow had fallen in the night, a thin dust that glimmered in the torchlight. Nearby, a stable hand was tending to the horses, offering them a rub-down and a meager ration of oats. The stable hand paused to bow when he saw her. She offered a faint nod of acknowledgement and continued on. She thought to herself that a quick walk might steady her nerves. She circled the courtyard, boots crunching on the frosty ground. The ramparts above were manned by guards, their silhouettes black against the pre-dawn sky. From the gloom, she spotted Lady Mormont's figure emerging from the main gate, likely also seeking fresh air before the day's trials. They exchanged a brief glance of mutual understanding. No words were needed. Battle weighed on both of them. At last, the horizon lightened from pitch to a sullen gray. and the men stirred to life. She donned her armor by torchlight, the metal cold against her body. She wore a thick padding beneath it, mindful of the brutal northern winds. Oathkeeper's scabbard rested against the wall. She took up the sword, drew it a few inches, and let it catch the meager torchlight. It was a good blade, forged from Ned Stark's ice, and she prayed it might be put to swift, just purpose today. She strapped it on, the weight a familiar comfort. Lady Mormont and the captain had gathered a small group of men, archers slinging quivers over their shoulders, swordsmen checking scabbard. Lord Slate appeared, still bleary-eyed, to watch them off. "The rest of the men stand ready," he told Brienne. "We'll begin broader sweeps once your assault begins. May the gods be with you." She thanked him, then mounted her horse, a sturdy bay with sure-footed confidence. Lady Mormont's mare stamped and snorted at the cold. Podrick rode close behind, scanning the men to ensure everyone was accounted for. A hush settled over the courtyard as they moved out. Torches sputtered in the wind, and the gate creaked open. They rode in 2 columns, about 30 strong, along a frozen track that paralleled the twisting river. Dawn gradually broke, a pale wash that revealed a sky thick with clouds. Thin ice skimmed the water's surface, dark currents swirling beneath. Occasionally, their horses slipped on patches of hoarfrost, forcing them to slow. The men hardly spoke, each mind on the confrontation that lay ahead. Their Dreadfort guide, the grizzled captain, pointed out a bend in the river. "That's the path leading to the old mill. We should dismount before the clearing, approach quietly on foot. The undergrowth beyond is thick enough to hide our approach." Brienne surveyed the area. Thick clusters of pines and frost-covered shrubs formed a natural barrier around the clearing. "We'll leave a few men with the horses. The rest come with us." Archers in a flanking position, swordsmen spread out. They advanced slowly, dismounting where the captain suggested. A few stable soldiers tethered the horses in the shelter of a rocky outcrop, while the main group formed up. The hush of the forest pressed in, broken only by the crunch of boots on frozen snow. Fallen branches snapped underfoot, an ominous echo in the cold air. The breath of each soldier rose like small clouds, drifting away amid the pines. Brienne's heart pounded, adrenaline beginning its familiar surge. She raised a hand to halt the group when they reached a slight ridge overlooking a narrow valley. There, crouching among the pine needles, she spotted the shape of the old mill, a crooked building of wood and stone perched near the river's bank. The water's churn once powered the mill wheel, but now the wheel stood broken, the paddles frozen in place. Faint wisps of smoke rose from what might be a makeshift campfire near the mill's side. Figures milled about, some cloaked and hunched against the cold. Brienne counted 5, perhaps 6 at a glance, but more could be inside or hidden. A single guard paced near the building's entrance, a crossbow at his shoulder. She felt a chill of anger coil in her stomach. Seeing them so at ease after the horrors they'd wrought, she turned to Lady Mormont and the captain. She kept her voice low. "We'll split. Archers, circle to the right, find vantage among those rocks. Swordsmen, come with me from the left. Once we engage, I want arrows to keep them from fleeing back into the trees. If they go for the river, the ice might not hold, and we can corner them at the bank." Lady Mormont nodded. "We strike hard and fast." Her breath steamed. "If the bandits surrender, do we take them alive?" Brienne considered. Part of her seethed at the brutality these men had shown, but she was no executioner of the innocent. "If they yield, we bind them. Lord Slate can decide their fate. But if they resist, we show no mercy." Nim Sheridan. A few men set arrows to bows with calm deliberation, the tension in their posture evident. Brienne led the swordsman down the slope, keeping low. The forest thinned near the mill, offering minimal cover. She inched forward, knees bent, hand on Oathkeeper's hilt, scanning for any sign that the bandits had noticed them. They were perhaps 20 yards from the building when a crow took flight from a nearby branch, cawing raucously. The guard at the entrance paused, turning his head sharply. Brienne froze, gesturing for her men to remain still. The guard stared into the trees, suspicion crossing his face. Then, with a grunt, he hefted the crossbow, scanning the tree line. Brienne's pulse thundered. She waited, until the guard seemed to relax fractionally. Then she gave the signal, an abrupt downward slash of her hand. Her archers on the right loosed a volley of arrows. The guard cried out, trying to raise his weapon, but an arrow took him squarely in the shoulder, spinning him around. Another arrow embedded in the wooden wall behind him. Shouts erupted inside the mill's camp. Figures scrambled out, some armed with spears, others with short bows. Brienne roared for her men to charge. She drew Oathkeeper, the steel flashing even in the dim morning light. Her boots pounded over snow and dead pine needles, her breath raw in her throat. The first bandit she encountered had barely lifted his spear when she slammed the flat of her blade against it, knocking it aside, and followed with a swift blow to his chest. He staggered, then fell. Beside her, Lady Mormont lunged at another foe who tried to fire an arrow at close range. Mormont's sword cleaved into the man's arm, and he howled, dropping to his knees. Arrows hissed past them, some burying themselves in the walls, others striking bandits who emerged from within. The scuffle intensified as a handful of outlaws rushed from a side doorway wielding axes. Their eyes were wild, their hair matted. She saw no uniforms, only ragged clothing, and the occasional scrap of leather with faint Bolton sigils, scratched out or painted over. Podrick darted in behind Brienne, blocking a spear thrust aimed for her side. He twisted his own blade, hooking the spear shaft and pulling it away. The bandit cursed, but Podrick advanced with surprising deftness, pushing the man off balance before finishing him with a slash across the chest. The man collapsed into the snow, staining it red. The chaos erupted along both flanks. Archers from the tree line kept up a steady fire, though the bandits dashed for cover behind half-collapsed walls. Brienne saw two of her men fall to crossbow bolts. Fury blossomed in her chest. She charged toward the main doorway, where the battered remains of the mill's gearworks lay strewn in piles of rotting wood. An outlaw tried to bar her path, brandishing a curved blade. He wore a tattered cloak with a patch that might once have been the flayed man. She felt a surge of revulsion and swung Oathkeeper in a broad arc. He managed to parry once, sparks flying, but her second strike hammered through his guard, carving a vicious line across his torso. He crumpled, gasping. The interior of the mill stank of old grain and damp rot. A faint light filtered through a hole in the roof. Broken sacks lay scattered, and near the far wall, a woman in soiled furs was fumbling with a bow. Her face twisted with hate as she notched an arrow and aimed at Brienne. Brienne dove aside, the arrow whipping past her ear to splinter against a beam. She scrambled forward on one knee, hooking the woman's ankle with the tip of Oathkeeper, toppling her. Before the outlaw could recover, Brienne pressed her blade against her neck. "Surrender," Brienne spat, heart pounding. "Drop the weapon, and you live." The woman's eyes flickered wildly, as though she might try one last strike. Then something in her face cracked. Her grip slackened, the bow falling from her grasp. She lay trembling, breath ragged. Brienne glanced around to see if any other threats lurked inside, but found no one else. She heard the shouts outside, the clash of steel. Her men seemed to be pushing the bandits back, though it was impossible to know if all would yield or be cut down. Brienne yanked a length of rope from her belt, pressing a knee to the woman's shoulder. The outlaw hissed in pain but did not resist further. As Brienne bound her wrists, she could see the stain of old bruises on the woman's forearms. Part of her wondered what twisted path had led these people to cling to a symbol of cruelty, but there was no time for pity. She dragged the woman to her feet, shoving her against the wall. "Stay," she ordered. "Try to run, and you'll be shot." She stepped back outside, blinking against the stark white glare of the snow. The fight was all but over. A few bandits had thrown down their weapons, raising trembling hands. Others lay sprawled on the ground, either dead or badly wounded. A number of Brienne's men knelt by the fallen, checking for signs of life. Lady Mormont stood in the middle of the clearing, breathing heavily, her sword dripping dark rivulets onto the trampled snow. She surveyed the scene, chest heaving. Podrick approached Brienne, a small cut bleeding on his forearm, but he seemed otherwise uninjured. Brienne's voice carried in the stillness. "Any more survivors?" Her men shook their heads. One of the archers gestured toward the side of the mill, where a cluster of captive bandits were being corralled. 3 men, 2 women, all sullen-faced, some bleeding from shallow wounds. She counted bodies in the snow, 8 or 9 outlaws who would not torment another hamlet. She saw 2 of her own men lying still. Her heart sank at the sight. She knelt by one, a younger soldier from Winterfell, eyes now glazed over, an arrow lodged in his chest. She bowed her head for a brief moment of silent respect, then gently closed his eyelids. Duty hardened her heart once more. They would not have died in vain if this victory helped end the terror. Lady Mormont came to stand beside her. "We'll gather the dead and wounded," she said, her voice gruff but reverent. "You fought well, my lady." Brienne let out a slow breath. "We'll see if we can glean information from the prisoners about the rest of their group. This can't be all of them." The letter mentioned as many as 30 or more. "We've accounted for fewer than half that number." Podrick wiped his brow with a gloved hand. "Do you think their leader was here?" She looked around. None of the fallen had the presence or gear of a commanding figure. They all seemed ragged, half-starved. "It's unlikely," she said. "We've only found stragglers. Perhaps the leader and the larger force are camped elsewhere. Let's question these prisoners." The bound outlaws had been forced to their knees, wrists tied behind them. One of them, a bearded man with a deep gash across his cheek, stared defiantly up at Brienne. Blood trickled down his face. She studied him, noting a brand on the side of his neck. At first, she couldn't discern its shape, but on closer inspection, it resembled a flayed man. A bolt of disgust shot through her. This one was loyal indeed, or had been forced into some twisted ceremony of Bolton allegiance. She crouched in front of him, her voice cold. "Who commands you? Where's the rest?" He spat at her feet. "You think I'd tell you anything, bitch? You have no idea what's coming. We're gonna..." He never finished the sentence. Lady Mormont planted a firm kick against his ribcage, and he toppled onto his side with a grunt. She placed the tip of her sword near his throat. "Watch your tongue," she growled, "or you'll lose it." He glared up, chest heaving, but fear flickered in his eyes now. He winced as Mormont pressed the blade closer, and a thin line of blood blossomed at his neck. Brienne nodded to Lady Mormont, who withdrew the sword but kept it near. Then Brienne spoke again, quieter. "Tell us what we want to know, or things will go poorly. You're outnumbered, outmatched. Spare yourself further pain." He rasped for breath, eyes darting toward the other prisoners. One of the women stared back at him, her face ashen. He seemed to weigh his options, then grimaced. "They're holed up. Somewhere else. This was just a scouting party, a place to rest. We trade supplies with others." Brienne's gaze hardened. "Where?" He hesitated. Lady Mormont angled her sword near his throat again. He let out a whimper. "Fine, dine, Dotteen. They hide near the old watchtower in the Pine Hills, north of the Weeping Water. Maybe a dozen or more. The leader, he calls himself Rolf Bolton, says he has true Bolton blood in his veins. That's all I know. For the gods' sake, let me be." "Nemo, Darrow." Brienne stepped back, a spark of grim satisfaction in her eyes. So there was a self-proclaimed Bolton scion after all. It sickened her to think the name might carry on through some byblow. But if that was the reality, she would see it extinguished for good. She gestured, and 2 of her men grabbed the bandit roughly, hauling him to his knees again. She turned to the rest of the prisoners, scanning their fearful faces. "Does anyone care to refute that story?" Silence. One of the women shook her head, trembling. Another man hung his head. They offered no further words. Brienne motioned to her soldiers. "Bind them securely. We'll take them back to the Dreadfort for Lord Slate to handle. Let the wounded be treated, but keep them under close watch. If any attempt to flee, shoot them down." Her men complied, pulling the prisoners to their feet and marching them off. She watched them go, a swirl of conflicting emotions in her chest. These were brutal men and women, but some might have been born into poverty or misfortune that led them to such violence. Yet the atrocities they committed could not be forgiven. Justice was justice. Lady Mormont sheathed her sword, glancing at Brienne. "We should send a raven to Lord Slate. If there's a larger gathering near that watchtower, we can muster more men. Crush them once and for all." Brienne agreed. "Yes. Let's search the mill for supplies first, then move out. We'll take our dead back to the Dreadfort to be properly honored, and bury the outlaws in a mass grave. We can't linger here. We can't linger here. They scoured the mill and found small stashes of stolen grain, a few battered crates of salted fish, and a handful of ragged furs. It was hardly a treasury, but it spoke to how these raiders lived, constantly on the move, hoarding whatever they stole. The building itself was half collapsed, the roof leaking daylight through broken beams. In the corner, near a damp wall, Brienne noticed a battered chest. One of the men pried it open, revealing old Bolton regalia, a tarnished badge of the flayed man, some scraps of pinkish cloth. Brienne felt a wave of revulsion. She took one piece of cloth in her hand, seeing the flayed man's symbol stitched with red thread. She cast it aside in disgust. By the time they finished, the light had grown stronger. The clearing was a grim sight, bodies lying still, trampled snow, blackened patches where the outlaws' fire had burned. Her men formed a small procession for their fallen comrades, carrying them on makeshift litters. Brienne walked behind them, head bowed, escorting the dead in silence. The captives trudged along in ropes, flanked by guards. The pace was slow and solemn. Their journey back to the Dreadfort took the remainder of the day, for they moved with caution and the weight of grief. They reached the fortress near dusk. The sight of the grim towers brought no comfort, but at least there was a measure of security behind the walls. Lord Slate met them in the courtyard. His expression tightened at the sight of the dead and the battered faces of the prisoners. Brienne dismounted wearily, and he waited for her report. She spoke quietly, mindful of the men listening. We found a group at the old mill and drove them out. 2 of my soldiers fell, a few more wounded. These prisoners claim the rest of their band is near a watchtower north of the Weeping Water. The leader calls himself Rolf Bolton. Nentersuan. Lord Slate's eyes flickered with rage at the mention of a Bolton claimant. Gods. If that's true, it must be stamped out. I'll see these prisoners pay for what they've done. He gestured to his guards, who began dragging the outlaws toward the dungeons. One prisoner, the woman Brienne had captured inside the mill, looked back with wide eyes, as if expecting some last reprieve. Finding none, she lowered her gaze and stumbled onward, disappearing into the gloom of the keep. Slate ran a hand through his hair, turning his attention to the fallen Winterfell soldiers. Your men will be honored. We'll prepare a pyre or a burial as you prefer. I'm sorry for your losses. Brienne nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. We'll see they're laid to rest with respect. She looked around for Lady Mormont, finding her in conversation with the Dreadfort's captain. The men from Bear Island were grim-faced but resolute. They had fought bravely. Some even had fresh wounds, though none appeared life-threatening. Slate continued, glancing at the darkening sky. We can muster more men. If Rolf Bolton is gathering a larger force, we need to deal with him swiftly. I'll send ravens to any nearby lords still loyal to House Stark, requesting additional support. And you, my lady, how would you proceed? Brienne's gaze shifted to the gates beyond. Her limbs ached from the day's fight, but her mind churned with possibilities. We must strike before they scatter again. We'll coordinate a larger expedition to the watchtower. But first, we rest and tend our wounded. Day after tomorrow, we ride out with all the forces we can spare. I won't give them time to muster a counterattack. Now. Slate nodded in agreement. I'll see to the ravens at once. The courtyard gradually fell into a solemn hush as men carried the fallen inside and set them in the keep's lower hall. Brienne stood near them, removing her gauntlets and cradling them under one arm. She looked upon the young face of the soldier who had died with an arrow in his chest. She still remembered how he'd smiled that morning, resolute and eager. The cost of leadership weighed heavily on her heart. She had commanded him into danger, and now his life's blood was on the snow. Yet this was the burden she had accepted. She would see it through. Podrick approached, quietly respectful. My lady, I've seen to the wounded. Our maester from Winterfell is assisting Lord Slade's healers. I'm sorry about the men we lost. She closed her eyes briefly. I know. We did what we had to do. Thank you, Pod. You fought bravely. Without you, we might have suffered more casualties. He nodded, but his eyes flicked to the dead, and she saw the weight in his expression. What now? She exhaled. We regroup. Tomorrow, we bury the dead or burn them, whichever their families would have wished. Then the next day, we march on the watchtower. We must face their leader. Podrick's hand twitched at the hilt of his sword. I'll ride beside you. She gave him a faint, grateful smile. I wouldn't have it otherwise. They parted, and Brienne found her way to the keep's main hall, where a meager supper was again arranged. She ate little. Exhaustion dulled her appetite. Lady Mormont joined her, silently pushing stew around in her bowl, occasionally muttering about the dogs, who dared sully the north with Bolton banners. At one point, she looked at Brienne and said quietly, "We'll avenge the ones we lost. It's the northern way." Brienne nodded, meeting her gaze. "Yes, we'll make sure of it." That night, she tried to sleep, but the fortress seemed more oppressive than ever. Every corridor echoed with the ghosts of older times. Every gust of wind moaned through the arrow slits. She huddled under her cloak, lying on a cot in a small chamber that smelled faintly of musty straw. But outside, men patrolled the walls, and she heard their distant boots scrunching on snow. She dozed for a while, but nightmares woke her. Images of men wearing flayed man badges, screaming peasants, the reek of burning huts. She forced the dreams away and eventually sank into a restless slumber that ended too soon with the gray hush of morning. She rose stiffly, splashing cold water on her face from a basin. Though tired, her resolve had hardened. The false Bolton had to be stopped. She armed herself in the morning gloom, though there was no battle that day, only ceremonies and preparations. She joined the men in carrying the dead out to a clearing near the fortress walls, where a funeral pyre had been built. The sun's weak rays fell across the wood, and the men's breath rose like faint ghosts. One by one, they laid the fallen upon the pyre. Some of the Dreadfort soldiers murmured words to the old gods. Others simply bowed their heads. Podrick stood at Brienne's side, his face taut with sorrow. Lord Slade gave a short eulogy, voice carrying across the hushed courtyard. These men came to aid the Dreadfort in a time of need. For that, we owe them our deepest gratitude. May the old gods guide their spirits. We light this pyre so that their sacrifice will burn bright in our memory. One of Lady Mormont's archers stepped forward with a torch, the flame guttering in the wind. He touched it to the oil-soaked logs. Fire crackled to life, devouring the wood. Black smoke curled skyward, carrying the smell of pine sap and ash. Brienne felt tears threaten behind her eyes, but she blinked them back, standing rigid. She had to be the pillar they leaned on, as Sansa had once said. After the ceremony, the men dispersed to finish chores or care for the wounded. Brienne turned her attention to gathering intelligence on the watchtower. The Dreadfort's captain showed her old maps, detailing a ruined stone tower perched on a bluff near the thickest part of the pine forest. It had once served as a lookout post centuries ago, but now it was little more than a collapsed shell. Yet it offered a vantage for any who sought to monitor the land. She spent hours poring over the routes to approach it, the likely places for ambush, the constraints of the terrain in winter. Podrick helped, reading the notes the Maester compiled, while Lady Mormont conferred with her Bear Island men on tactics. Scouts were sent ahead at dusk, tasked with returning by dawn with news of any activity near the tower. The men would have one night to rest properly before the final confrontation. She found sleep elusive again, but forced herself to lie down, if only to conserve energy. The shadows in her chamber seemed to flicker with the faint torch in the corridor, dancing on the wall like wraiths. Once or twice, she heard shouts or cries from the dungeons below, echoing up the stone stairwells. Perhaps the prisoners were lamenting their fates. She shut her eyes and told herself those men deserved no solace for what they had done. Still, a cold sweat broke across her skin as she listened to distant moans that seemed to carry the memory of 1,000 torments that had played out in this keep over the centuries. By dawn, the scouts returned, breathless and weary, bearing confirmation that a number of outlaws had indeed gathered near the watchtower. Likely more than a dozen. They had glimpsed tents, cooking fires, and even a few horses tethered near the ruin. It was enough to confirm the presence of a significant group. Brienne donned her armor again, this time with an undercurrent of grim satisfaction. She would not let them slip away. Lord Slate mustered every able-bodied soldier left in the Dreadfort. Combined with Brienne's forces and Lady Mormont's warriors, they could field nearly 200 men for the assault. This time, there would be no stealthy approach with small numbers. Brienne intended to strike swiftly and overwhelmingly, preventing any chance of escape. If Rolf Bolton and his followers tried to run, they would be cut off from every side. The ultimate battle was at hand. The courtyard swelled with the clang of arms and the snort of horses. Men formed ranks, some bearing the improvised sigil of Slate, a crimson tower. Others were the dire wolf of House Dark, or the bear of House Mormont. Brienne herself wore no sigil upon her armor, but carried the weight of Winterfell's authority. She felt the press of eyes upon her as she swung onto her horse. The chill stung her cheeks, and she inhaled a shaky breath. Her voice rang out in the icy air. "We ride to end the threat of these Bolton loyalists. They have murdered the innocent, burned their homes, and defied the peace the North fought dearly to earn. Show them no quarter if they resist. For the North!" A ragged cheer rose, echoing against the high walls. The gates creaked open, revealing the snowy plains beyond. The mass of riders and foot soldiers poured out, forging a line that snaked across the whitened landscape. The wind cut through them, but the men pressed forward, hearts warmed by the promise of justice and an end to fear. Lady Mormont rode at Brienne's side, lips set in a grim line. Podrick rode just behind, scanning the horizon. Lord Slate flanked them with his own retinue. Brienne steadied her mount, feeling the familiar churn of adrenaline. She clung to the knowledge that this was necessary. No half measure would suffice when dealing with those who invoked the flayed man. They followed the river for a short distance before cutting northeast, climbing gradually into the pine hills. The terrain grew uneven, forcing them to slow. Scouts raced ahead, weaving through snow-laden glens. Returning to report the path was clear so far. Only the caw of distant crows and the murmuring wind accompanied them. Near midday, they paused at a ridgeline from which they could glimpse the watchtower's broken silhouette. Smoke rose from several fires below, small and scattered. It looked as though the outlaws had established a rudimentary encampment along the tower's base, using the ruined stone walls as partial shelter. The stark whiteness of the snow made those dark shapes stand out clearly. Though the swirling pines provided them some cover, Brienne listened as the captain described a plan to encircle the area. Men with bows would climb the ridge on the left, forming a wide arc. The main force of swords and spears would advance from the right, gradually pushing the outlaws toward the ridge where archers lay in wait. She nodded, turning to Lady Mormont and Lord Slate. "We strike as one, no horns or loud signals until we're in position. We rely on speed." They proceeded with care. Groups split off, vanishing into the trees to take their assigned positions. The hush of impending battle settled like a blanket over them all. Brienne felt each heartbeat pounding in her chest. She motioned for Podrick to remain close, and for a handful of her best fighters to be her personal guard. If Rolf Bolton truly commanded these men, she wanted to confront him personally. She felt a distant anger that any would dare claim that name and bring fear to the North again. The time came. A scout waved a torch from the far ridge. One quick flash, the signal that the archers were in place. Brienne lifted her sword, and the world seemed to slow. Then, with a shout, she spurred her horse forward, the front line surging toward the watchtower encampment. Snow flew in clumps beneath the horse's hooves, men bellowed war cries, and the wind whipped her hair around her face. Shouts rose from the outlaw camp. Figures burst from under makeshift tents, scrambling for weapons. Some wore old Bolton leathers, others had only patchwork armor. But they all recognized that they were under a coordinated attack. Within moments, arrows rained from the ridges above, pelting the camp in a deadly staccato. Brienne saw at least 3 outlaws drop before they could properly arm themselves. She led the charge around the tower's crumbling side, sword raised high. An outlaw tried to stand in her path, spear leveled. She shifted her horse's direction and struck downward. Oathkeeper clanged against the spearhead, deflecting it, then sliced into the man's side. He crumpled, screaming. The horse reared slightly, and she fought to keep it under control, pivoting to seek any sign of a leader. The chaos was immediate. Outlaws darted for cover behind collapsed walls, some returning fire with bows or crossbows. A volley of arrows from the ridges forced them to crouch low, pinned. Lady Mormont and her Bear Island warriors slammed into the flank, swords clashing against axes. She glimpsed Mormont in the midst of the melee, eyes fierce. Slate's men advanced from the rear, ensuring no route of escape. Brienne dismounted to better navigate the rubble near the tower base. She rushed forward on foot, Podrick close behind, cutting through a swirl of smoke from a knocked-over brazier. Two outlaws lunged at her with short swords, snarling curses. She parried the first blow, shifting to avoid the second, and delivered a punishing kick to one man's knee. He collapsed with a shriek, and a swift strike from Oathkeeper ended his threat. The other, seeing his comrade's fate, tried to retreat, but Podrick lunged from the side, blade scoring across the man's chest. The outlaw stumbled, dropping his sword, and Podrick finished him with a decisive thrust. From somewhere within the battered remains of the tower's archways, Brienne heard a voice screaming for the outlaws to hold the line. She pushed forward, climbing over a fallen beam. Loose stones rolled under her boots. Ahead, a stocky man with a ragged black beard bellowed at his men, urging them to fight or face his wrath. He wore a battered cuirass, the faint image of a flayed man partially scratched away, partially repainted. She caught a glimpse of madness in his eyes as he swung a crude longsword at one of her men, cutting him down. She recognized something in his features, a certain hawkish nose, the set of his jaw, that could, at a stretch, tie him to the Bolton lineage if rumor was believed. Rage flared in her chest. This must be Rolf Bolton. She would end him here and now. She waded through the fray, slicing aside any outlaw who blocked her. The crash of steel, the hiss of arrows, and the cries of the wounded filled her ears. She saw Podrick out of the corner of her eye, fighting two outlaws at once, holding his own. Lady Mormont had joined with Slate's men to secure the perimeter, ensuring no escapes. Blood slicked the snow, bodies littered the rubble. Rolf Bolton turned just as Brienne closed the distance. She swung Oathkeeper in a wide arc, forcing him to block hastily, his blade shuddering against hers. His eyes burned with fury, and spittle flew from his lips as he snarled. "Who are you to stand in my way? This land is mine by right of blood." Brienne pressed him back, teeth bared. "Your blood is cursed," she spat. "The Boltons are finished. You'll not terrorize the North any longer." She shoved forward, her superior strength driving him off balance. He managed to roll aside, pulling a dagger with his free hand. He slashed at her leg, but her armor deflected the blow. She swung downward, and he caught Oathkeeper's blade awkwardly with his sword, sparks flying. His dagger lunged for her midsection. She twisted, letting the blade scrape across her cuirass, then shoved him hard, sending him stumbling backward. He fell onto a heap of stones, cursing as he struggled to rise. She advanced, refusing to grant him an instant's reprieve. He bared his teeth in a crazed grin, eyes filled with desperation and hate. "You think you can destroy the Bolton name? It lives in me. I'll flay you alive before I let you." His words ended in a roar as he surged forward again. Brienne met him with a resounding clash of steel. She spun Oathkeeper in a tight, controlled arc, her technique honed by years of relentless practice. His parry was too slow. The Valyrian steel bit deep into his side, cutting through leather and flesh. He gasped, dropping his dagger. Blood poured from the wound, staining the snow at his feet. She kicked his sword away. He collapsed to his knees, trying to staunch the bleeding. His wild gaze met hers, flickers of agony and disbelief warring in his face. She raised Oathkeeper, tip pointed at his throat. Around them, the remnants of the battle raged, but she was focused on this final confrontation. "Yield," she commanded. "Stop your men." He only sneered, coughing up blood. "A Bolton never yields," he choked. He looked at her blade, as if trying to summon the strength for one final blow. Then, with a guttural snarl, he lunged. She drove Oathkeeper forward in reflex, ending it swiftly. The steel slid between his ribs. His eyes widened in shock, and a ragged breath rattled free. When she withdrew the blade, he slumped forward, limbs slack, face twisted in an expression of rage he would carry to the grave. His blood soaked into the white snow, leaving a vivid scarlet bloom. Brienne allowed herself a single, shuddering exhale. She had done what was necessary. The line of Boltons ended here, if this man truly carried any Bolton blood at all. Around her, the remaining outlaws were throwing down arms or lying dead. Podrick rushed over, panting, a streak of blood across his cheek. He saw Rolf's body and let out a relieved breath. "Is that?" She nodded. "He's gone." He called himself Bolton. She glanced down at the corpse, feeling no triumph, only the heavy sense that a foul chapter had finally closed. But the cost was steep. Turning her gaze to the battlefield, she saw wounded men, both her own and the outlaws, moaning in the snow. Some outlaws still tried to fight, but they were swiftly overwhelmed by the combined forces circling them. When the final sword clattered to the ground, Lady Mormont and Lord Slate converged, both breathing heavily. Slate stared at Rolf's body, and for a moment, a grim satisfaction crossed his face. "We'll burn him," he said. "To be sure." Brienne nodded. "See it done." She looked at the battered ruins of the watchtower. The swirl of smoke from burning tents was acrid in the air. Bodies lay everywhere. Another short, brutal engagement, but hopefully the last. A wave of exhaustion washed over her. She staggered, knees threatening to buckle, but steadied herself. Podrick reached for her arm. "Are you wounded?" She shook her head, pressing a hand to a dent in her cuirass. "No, just tired." The adrenaline began to ebb, leaving her limbs heavy and her mind raw. Lady Mormont leaned on her sword, scanning the area for survivors. "We've captured a few who threw down their arms. The rest are dead." Her face was set in a grim mask. Whatever vile legacy the Boltons left, it's over now. Brienne looked up at the gray sky, flakes of snow drifting anew. For a long moment, she breathed in the cold air, letting it fill her lungs. A sense of finality settled in her chest. She knew that outlaws and bandits might always roam, but at least this particular threat had been quashed. The memory of the flayed man, once a symbol of terror, had been dragged into the light and destroyed. And she, standing as Lady of Winterfell in Sansa's stead, had carried out her duty to protect the North. The cost had been high. Lives lost in the snow, wounded men bearing scars they would carry forever. But she had led them honestly and bravely, refusing to shrink from the dangers. She felt, in that moment, a stirring of quiet pride. She had done what she had always promised, kept her oath, defended the innocent, honored her vow to House Stark. Podrick touched her shoulder gently. "My lady, we should tend to the wounded, gather what supplies we can, then return to the Dreadfort." He glanced around at the devastation. "No point lingering here." She nodded, lowering Oathkeeper to rest at her side. Her armor felt so very heavy, yet there was relief in it too. Relief that the day's horror would not last forever. She turned to the men, some of whom still circled the area. "See you are fallen," she called. "Treat the wounded outlaws as well. We do not kill those who surrender." A handful of outlaws were rounded up, their faces shocky and pale. Some looked as though they could barely stand. She ordered them bound, though she could not say what fate awaited them. Likely they would stand trial before Lord Slate, or be turned over to Winterfell for final judgment. She felt no mercy for their crimes, but as she had told Lady Mormont, if they yielded, they would at least be spared immediate execution. Let justice take its course. Men swarmed the campsite, extinguishing small fires, collecting weapons, searching tents for anything of value or hazard. Brienne stood in the center, near Rolf Bolton's body, letting the swirl of activity pass around her. She closed her eyes for a brief instant, remembering the vow she had made to Catelyn Stark, and later to Sansa, she would protect and serve. Perhaps this was how she would uphold that promise, day by day, until there were no more threats. She felt a hand on her arm and saw Lady Mormont giving her a short nod. "It's done," Mormont said. "He won't haunt the North any longer." Brienne nodded in return. She found her voice surprisingly steady. "Then let's clean up what remains and move on. Winterfell awaits." Behind them, the pine forest swayed in the wind, and clouds scudded across the pale sky. Smoke curled from the smoldering remains of the bandit camp. The last vestige of that false Bolton claim lay dead in the snow, red staining white. Brienne of Tarth, Lady of Winterfell, lifted her gaze to the horizon. She thought of the future, of the people who now might live free of that old shadow, and felt a faint, fierce hope warming her from within. She brushed the snow from Oathkeeper's blade, sheathed it, and turned to rejoin her men, ready for whatever burden her station demanded next.